Well, my name is Amal Laghlid and I work for PwC here in London, but I used to work for the OECD on governance, so I'm familiar with the peer review mechanism. My question is actually related to the focus on the results. How do we manage to find the right balance? Because, I mean, this is something that was mentioned by most of the panelists. For example, payments by results is sometimes likely to put a lot of pressure on some small NGOs, likely to struggle with delivering the projects while also not having the right capabilities to report in the right formats required. As you know, impact is not only dependent on the quality of the project or the work done by service providers, but sometimes it's also dependent on the capacity of recipients, or sometimes it's also the political issues, security issues, especially in fragile states or some of developing countries. So how do we manage to find the right balance to focus on the results? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, one more.
Nigel Peters from British Expertise. Really, yes, just to follow up on that. I think Eric was, in his diplomatic way, as Simon was saying that there is the danger of putting, how do you measure results in complex technical assistance projects in fragile states? And indeed, the ICAI report on DFID's work in fragile states was an amber red one, shows the real difficulties I think companies have. And we all, payment by results, if you're delivering 1,000 bed nets, is relatively easy, but it's the challenge of these large complex infrastructure and other projects. So, yeah, I would support and sort of, yeah.
Okay. What do you have? One more here.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on this.
Sorry, you are?
I'm Frances Stewart from Oxford University. I just wanted to comment on the allusion to the possibility of DFID being incorporated back into the Foreign Office. And I do think that would be very damaging because although, of course, there is a foreign policy interest in aid and there's a trade policy interest in aid, I think DFID goes beyond that and at least thinks of itself as working in the wider interests of poor people and the world, and I think that will get lost. So I hope that this proposal is not going to be taken too seriously.
Thank you. Okay, we'll just take those three. Who I think the first two were related, which is how best or how better to balance the need for results, especially in fragile states with the sort of overkill on the demands we make. Mark, do you want to?
Well, can I just say, she won't remember, but exactly 30 years ago, Frances taught me the development economics module in Oxford. I think this is the first time we've seen each other since then, and you can make your own judgment about how good an investment that was for the... but it's lovely to see you, and thank you for your question. I'm afraid your question is actually a bit above my pay grade, but thank you for putting it on the agenda. On the payment by results issue, I would just direct you to a exchange I had over about 10 or 15 minutes in the select committee where Malcolm and his colleagues were scrutinising us in the context of the annual report, where Fiona Bruce, a member of the select committee, asked me a series of piercing questions on our approach to this and how to strike the balance. And so I'm not going to repeat everything I said there because it did last 15 minutes, the exchange. But the sort of headline point is you need to have a better way of thinking about whether you're achieving what you want to achieve than simply either, in the case of the private sector, being paid for the amount of time that you spend on something, which in the past has too often been the default way of getting paid, or in the case of some NGOs, sort of being paid on the basis of the passion and commitment and worthiness with which you approach the objectives. You do have to be a bit more rigorous about whether taxpayers' money is doing the sorts of things you want it to do. And I think that was the point that the reviewers made, and where they kind of got the balance where they did get the balance was because we have worked hard to try and strengthen our results system, but we've tried to do it in a way which doesn't it doesn't create a whole additional set of distortions. And there's a good debate to be had about whether we've got the balance right or not, but you do need a balance.
I may be too passionate on this, but I mean, for so many years, I heard so many excuses from the development community for why there should not be a focus on results. There was any excuse that it was so difficult, it could not be measured, it was impossible, etc., etc. So every civil society organization who came to me in Norway when I was a minister made all sorts of excuses for why results should not be measured. So I'm very firmly, my starting point is very, very firmly on the other side. We need to measure results, and we need to make certain that people see results. Then comes the qualification on that basis that obviously some items are much more easily measured than others. Some results can be measured in fairly simple quantitative terms, some cannot. When it cannot, doesn't mean that you should not measure results, but you cannot just put a table showing the result. You must make some sort of analysis, a historical, a political science, whatever analysis, to make certain that it's likely that you have achieved results. And for sure, this could not and will be a complete misunderstanding if measuring results should mean that you should only go where the results are easily achievable. That will be a distortion. Obviously, if you want to bring people out of poverty, it will be much more easy to do it in the quantitative terms if you decided to focus on China than if you decided to focus on the Central African Republic. It's absolutely obvious. So it cannot be that simple way of measuring. You must measure on the basis of the conditions where you do something. But the starting point must be that we want to make certain that there are results and we want to measure these results. Otherwise, in the long term, we will never be able to defend this in meeting with the poor. I mean, they want results. Nor will we be able to tell the taxpayers or those voluntarily contributing to civil society organizations if we are not absolutely firm on that as a starting point, and then comes the qualifications.
Any points on that, Sir Malcolm, especially maybe in fragile states? How do we get that balance?
I think the first thing is, we've had to defend the 0.7%. It's a very good way of defending it, to be able to demonstrate that it's delivered quantifiable results. So, that protects the actual budget, which is quite important. I think it's quite a good commentary, actually, in the DAC report, which acknowledges the difficulties and does say there's always room for improvement. Also, what results? Maybe you're measuring the wrong results, and maybe the time involved is disproportionate to what you're trying to do. But that seems to me that's about getting the process right, not abolishing the process. And I think there is a danger of it being an excuse. And in fact, it's not a bad thing to be told that DFID is a tough taskmaster. Again, when I'm trying to defend the department, those kind of quotes are helpful. So I mean. If I give you a random example of an MDG that didn't really deliver what it was intended, which is the enrolment, of children. Well, enrolment on one day, but no follow through, no measurement of output. So I would rather people had a proper discussion about what we're trying to measure and whether we're measuring the right thing in the right way, and in the process perhaps engage with DFID and saying it can be done more quickly and more effectively than the way they impose. That has to be good, and that's where DFID has to be not arrogant, I suppose, prepared to engage, but they are the paymasters in the end, and they're entitled, I think, to ask for it. And just to be clear, the committee did not recommend that DFID should be merged into the Foreign Office. We were quite clear that it should remain as a standalone department. We did discuss it, and indeed we invited people to give evidence. The overwhelming evidence we had, perhaps understandably, was to protect the status quo. We didn't suggest that it's the only structure and that other countries can't deliver coherence and effectiveness because they don't have it, but I think what we concluded is we think it works for the UK, and we don't really think we got enough evidence to suggest we should change it.
Simon, do you have a last word on that point?
Well, just in the work that ODI is doing on the development agency of the future, there are very many different models, and we take the point that what matters is leadership. But, the development agenda is changing, and that's the problem. If you're working on poor countries, there are only 34 left. In a decade, there might be only 20 left. And so do we have a cabinet-level government department whose job is delivering services in 20 poor countries? That would be quite hard to sustain, I think. And if you look at what else DFID might be doing, the question of where the geographical boundaries lie becomes really problematic. If you're working on climate change, for example, of course Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda and so on matter, but so does Colombia. And if Colombia matters and Brazil, so does Mexico, and Mexico is already an OECD member, and Colombia is a candidate member of the OECD. So China, where do these boundaries lie, and what is the relationship of DFID to government departments that might be engaging with those countries? So yes, let's keep DFID because it is a centre of expertise, it's a conscience and an enforcer. But a lot of issues arise around cross-government networks, shared ministries, funds like the International Climate Fund or the new CSSF, finding ways in which government works really well together, and the DFID has a leadership role.
Okay, thank you. For the next round, I'm going to give the first question to Plan UK and Kenny Holsren, who I'm sure I've mangled her name because it's mostly consonants, from Plan UK, as I say. Can the panel share their views regarding the damage being caused by private sector engagement, especially in relation to sustainable development, environmental degradation, scarce water resources, use of child labour, and so on? What role does either DFID or the DAC have in ensuring that private sector investment leads to good and sustainable development and poverty reduction for all? So that's quite a big one. Next question. Sorry, we have the mic.
Sorry, who's that? Thanks. Emma Maudsley, Cambridge University. This follows on a little bit, actually. So, of course, we all know there's good private sector, good effects, bad effects. It's complicated, but let me be critical. Justine Greening has talked a lot about financialization, the big four, the accountancy firms, if you'll forgive me, the PwC speaker, companies that help tax avoidance on an industrial scale. It seems to me that there's very little reference in recent literature on the private sector from the DAC or from DFID about the dangers of financialisation. There's been very, very limited reform of global financial structures, and are we not exposing countries even more, including ourselves, to a financial system that remains unregulated, predatory, volatile, and so on. So could we hear a bit more about that very big issue, a global financial system that is still not even operating just in the interests of its shapers, but actually very beyond sometimes the interests of even its shapers?
Thank you. Right, Joe, we'll take the next one.
Joe Hanlon from LSE. I've been writing recently on small business and development, and one of the problems with the risk focus is it means that aid can't support small business. 2/3 of small businesses fail, by definition. What that means, what would the Daily Mail say if 2/3 of a project goes to businesses that fail? Yet we need the... But we need that other third of the businesses that succeed are the ones that create the jobs and so on. Now, what has happened with the risk focus is that we see DFID not being in a position to do credit guarantees and all sorts of other things, which are what small businesses desperately need. Comment one. Comment two on risk. One of the things that I've seen is that the focus on risk means that we've moved, DFID has moved totally away from the Paris and other agendas which said that the developing countries were going to lead, and that, at least in the countries that I work in, that the DFID is no longer following domestic agendas at all, is following its own agenda centrally.
Okay, all good questions. A bit of a sharper edge. One more.
Hi, Ken Caldwell from Baobab. I want to follow up the statement that Eric made at the beginning about the importance of civil society in the UK as part of the strong UK development consensus. One of the diplomatic criticisms in the report that you didn't highlight was a comment that said that DFID is not communicating, or the UK government is not communicating an overall vision for working with civil society. And I wanted to ask, particularly Mark, but possibly Sir Malcolm as well, whether you feel that criticism is fair. If so, how might DFID and an incoming government get to tackle this, and how might we in the NGO community best engage?
Thank you. So we've got I think the related questions of possible negative impact or definite negative impact of some private sector players in development, and some more mention of that, particularly the dangers of financialization. And maybe we'll take those two before we go on to the small business focus. But Mark, do you want to lead off on those?
Well, just to pick up a sort of 2 or 3 points that were made. Firstly, on Emma's point about inclusion or exclusion in the global financial system, I think the one thing that's worse than being included in the global financial system is being excluded from the global financial system. So the issue is about how to help countries build the capacity to engage in a way which is going to be good for their development. But there are more than 20 countries at the moment where, through the UK bilateral programme, we're supporting strengthening of the institutions responsible for tax policy and tax administration. And in too many of the countries where we work, the sort of tax take and the ability of the core institutions to grow the tax take is a big development problem. We have, of course, you have to recognise that a lot of the big taxpayers, or should be taxpayers, have a lot more professional capability than some of the institutions they're working with. And that's one of the reasons why Justine Greening was so keen for us to finance this new collaboration we've got between HMRC and at the moment about a dozen of their counterpart organisations around the world. So that peer-to-peer collaboration can, not just build the capability of their sister organisations, but promote better relationships and exchange of information, all that kind of thing. I think that's the way we have to go with that. On Joe's question, I think my main takeaway is we're not doing a very good job in communicating the scale of activity we do have with SMEs and broader range of financial instruments. I was in Tanzania, now probably arguably the country, last week I was there, the country with the biggest penetration through the whole of society of financial inclusion. A lot done through something called the Financial Sector Deepening Trust, which has helped the government of Tanzania create a lot more competition between financial service providers. So Tanzania has overtaken Kenya in terms of proportion of the population that's got access to some sort of financial services. And the argument made to me was that's because the government in Tanzania has created a framework and a regulatory system which has brought more competition into the market. And so there's more innovation than has been the case, it was said to me by the Tanzanians, in Kenya, where, of course, M-Pesa and Safaricom have had a dominant market position. And we are doing credit guarantees, by the way, and various other guarantee instruments in a number of places. But we need to communicate that better as the takeaway. Just on Ken's important question, for me, this isn't an issue about NGOs. This is an issue about civil society generally, which includes actually the corporate sector. It includes universities, the standard-setting bodies like our accountants or, the health standard-setting bodies. And I think, it's absolutely the case, as somebody alluded to, that we're sort of probably past the zenith point where the UK, the heart of the UK's comparative advantage on development is transferring the 0.7. Because the budget will be at 0.7 into the future. Other sources of finance for development are going to grow much faster. So most importantly of all, countries' domestic resource base, which is always the biggest source of resources for development. And that means that I think there's an important opportunity for the UK to think about what is our wider offer. And when I travel, a lot of what I hear about what's valued in our wider offer is the set of much deeper set of institutions there are in the UK, public, private, somewhere in the middle like the universities, a lot of whom have a lot of interaction already with these countries we're talking about, many of which are fast-growing market opportunities. How do we use the role of government and the department to facilitate in a developmentally productive way that much wider engagement? That I think is one of the really interesting questions for the rest of the decade.
Simon, you look like you want to jump in there.
I imagine you all read The Guardian, and you'll have noticed that it's been wrapped in Naomi Klein for the past couple of days. And I struggled a lot with capitalism versus the climate and wrote a long review of the book. And I want to say what I want to say carefully, because I know this is slightly contested territory between Justine Greening and Mary Craig, and the question of how you approach the private sector. I mean, I don't take the view, as Naomi Klein does, that capitalism is irredeemably damaging to everything and there's only one solution, which is to kind of go back to local economies. But I do think that capitalism needs to be regulated. And the issue then around what DFID does with the private sector is about what kinds of standards it insists on, which include transparency, but also ethical supply chains, fair trade or fair trade-like options, certification like IRIS or these various other measures of how well companies are doing. And clearly you could extrapolate from those ideas to see slightly different ways of approaching the private sector, and I guess those are partly in play in the political space. But unfettered capitalism without regulation won't do, and fettered capitalism with regulation probably will.
Eric, you had something to say on fettered or unfettered.
I mainly have the same view of private business or capitalism as I have of my wife or my children, meaning that I have no difficulty seeing their faults, but still they are a major force of good. The same here. I mean, there is no difficulty whatsoever finding all the problems with private business, private investment. For sure, you can find a number of investments which are negative, but overall, it's an enormous source for good. And the problem in the very poor nations, say Burundi, the problem is not that there is a huge number of companies going there and extracting their resources. The problem is that there are no Google or Microsoft strategy from Burundi whatsoever. No, nothing. I mean, the very poor are outside the global economic system. That's the main problem. So I think we must start any discussion about private business with the fact that without that, China, Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, whatever success story you want to point to, Ethiopia, will not have been a success story. You need more and better private investment. That must be the starting point. Then you can start with the difficulties. And one main difficulty, which we need to do a lot more on, is tax. When you do have a profit somewhere, you should pay tax. Your chancellor made clear that Microsoft, Google, and Starbucks are not paying taxes in the United Kingdom. Everyone running around here know that they do business here. Obviously, everyone knows that if they don't pay taxes here, they don't pay taxes in Central African Republic or South Sudan or Nepal or Ecuador. I mean, that's clear to everyone. You don't need to investigate the issue. And that cannot continue. And there are two main OECD programs here. One is called base erosion and profit shifting, and that is make certain that every company is paying the part of the tax where the tax belongs. And the other is automatic tax exchange, which means that if one government wants to know if their corrupt politicians or their big business people have put money in Chelsea soccer football district here in London, they should have the right to know. And this automatic tax exchange will now start. But it will work immediately very well, say, between the United Kingdom and Norway. Because if we want to investigate our tax evaders here, we have a huge tax authority. We will be able to immediately pose the right questions to your authorities, and your authorities will feel absolutely confident that the Norwegian authorities will be able to treat these in the right way. But it will be much, much more difficult for those nations needing it most, because they simply do not have the authority, the systems, the competence. In many very poor nations, I mean, the tax officials are a few individuals. So to make it work globally, we struggle with, and we simply need to move up the ladder here. And this is, when you ask the question, what's the next phase of UK development systems? This is one of it. And let me just end up with one figure. If we were able to increase the tax in the developing world with just 1%, that's not high tax levels, that's just to increase the generational taxes. 1% is double ODA.
Yep. Okay. Just quickly, then
Well,
we've
first of
got
all, Simon's just
one more.
pointed out to me that the law has just 0.7% has just been passed in the House of Lords and going to go for royal assent. So we have delivered something. I just wanted to say, first of all, we haven't published our report on jobs and livelihoods, but one piece of evidence was 600 million people are coming onto the jobs market in the next 5 years in the developing countries. So I don't think a crusade against the evils of the private sector is what we need. I think it's getting the right private sector engagement is what's needed, and by all means challenging DFID to try and do the right thing in the right way. And there are questions to ask there, but not the intent, it seems to me. And I also think, we've suggested, which is I can understand why DFID is hesitant, the idea of a development bank. But if you did build a development bank over time, it would gain some expertise and perhaps some comparative ability to engage in the fray, which may not otherwise exist within DFID. So that was the thinking behind it. I'm not saying it's the answer, but it's a suggestion that we think has some merit. And this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but in quite a lot of these countries, it's not international business that's the problem, it's just as much local business. Local elites who are exploiting their own countries and not paying tax. And I'm quite keen that anybody who's gaining a financial advantage in a developing country should pay taxes, whether they're inward investors or local investors on a fair basis. What tends to happen is the elite protect themselves, and it's the low and middle incomes in the poor countries who then get squeezed on tax. And I'll give you the specific example. When we did a report on Pakistan and identified that the then outgoing president, had been president for 4 or 5 years, had never even filed a tax return, had a wonderful multi-million-pound stucco mansion in west of London, and very ordinary people working on average wages in the UK are paying taxes to educate the people of Pakistan when the president wasn't paying a single penny of tax towards that. That's not right. It's as simple as that. So we have got to have a robust debate. And in Tanzania, the last time the committee visited, we were happy to meet the HMRC representative seconded within the DFID office to work with the Tanzanian government to increase their tax base. And to do it, I would say, in a fair and progressive way, but makes everybody feel they have to make a contribution. But the truth is, unless we can expand the private sector and create a climate for investment, we're going to have hundreds of millions of people with nothing to do. And that threatens, I think, global stability more than anything.
Okay. Can I make one other sort of public service announcement in respect of this issue that Malcolm's just touched on again on non-grant instruments. Eric and I spent quite a bit of time in the second half of last year trying to sort out one aspect of the non-grant ODA world, which is if you make a sovereign loan to a developing country, what ODA credit do you get for it? And the DAC agreed a new set of arrangements for that. But that was really the prelude to another really big issue, which is how do you use ODA and what should the rules for ODA be to incentivise lots of other flows, which are going to have the same standards as are required for something to score as ODA, but are going to draw in a wider pools of resources. 0.7% of anything is too small. So you have to think about, well, what about the 99.3? And there is an idea lacuna, actually, for thinking about how to create arrangements in the ODA system which would incentivise greater activity on things like guarantees and public-private partnerships and FDI and all those things, which is where the big prize is for development in terms of flows, in my opinion, rather than just the 0.7.
Okay, well, I'm really sorry to say I think we have run out of time. I'd like to thank everybody, especially the speakers, for their contributions, and thank you all for coming or for participating online. Just one announcement from me. This event's been organised by the Future Development Agencies programme at ODI, which is a new initiative supported by the Gates Foundation, exploring the changing development agenda and the international development agencies. On the 27th and 28th of April, the Future Development Agencies programme is convening a conference here at ODI with about 50 to 60, we hope, high-level participants, including other directors of development agencies from all over the world, academics, think tanks, and everyone else, to discuss those very issues. So do keep an eye on that, and we'd be very happy to see many of you back there. Meanwhile, for those in the room, are very welcome to join us for refreshments outside, and thanks again to everyone for coming or for participating. Thank you.